Welcome to another episode of Unsubscribe, the Demand Drive podcast. It is I, your host, AJ Alonso, joined by my co-host, as always, Alex Ellison. Alex, how are you today?
I'm good. We have this fun situation where we both came into the office today, which hasn't really happened in a while, and now we have to record.
You live across the country, like that's
right, exactly. But now we get this fun, like, oh, we're in the same office, but we can't be in the same room for this meeting.
You're like right over there. But tough for the audio only listeners to imagine what I just did there. So yeah. I'll let you fill that in with your imagination.
Go watch this on YouTube. Easy answer.
Alex, we've got a fantastic guest with us today. I'm very excited. Karlie Morien. She is the Senior Director of Sales Dev over at Greenlight Guru. Karlie, why don't you give the audience an idea of who you are, what you do, sort of the Karlie 101, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, guys, for having me again. I'm Karlie. I am a sales development guru. Maybe. I like that. I think I'll stick with it. My passion is all things inside sales, sales development, and sales. So my background is really in building and scaling SDR teams, and my passion is really helping folks grow in their SDR careers and then finding what their next home looks like, whether that be in sales or somewhere else. So yeah, again, thank you for having me. Super happy to be here again and record podcast number 2 with you guys.
Yeah, I'm excited. Make sure everyone, based on the fact that you just said that, go back and listen to the episode that Karlie recorded for the SDRev podcast that we did. Some good stuff in there. Time management, right? It was making sure that you're actively and effectively using your time as a rep and as a leader, which is crucial, very crucial to making sure that you're successful.
Yep, agreed.
So this episode, we're moving away from time management. You touched on that. Everyone knows exactly what to do now that they've listened to that. Pause this episode, go listen to that one, come back to this one. I'll wait. Cool. Thank you.
Welcome
back. Today, I want to talk with you about this idea of specialization within the sales development world. I find that a lot of organizations, and when I say a lot, I would say a majority of them, look at the SDR role as, because it's bottom of the totem pole, because it's a very inexperienced junior member of the organization, there's almost like, why bother specializing it? Like their responsibility is pretty cut and dry, right? Like generate appointments for the sales team. And I think there's either a level of sophistication that a lot of teams don't understand about the role or just choose to neglect in any capacity when they set the function up. And a lot of that falls under this idea of specializing inbound versus outbound versus a bunch of other responsibilities that the rep has. And I know you've done that very successfully at Greenlight Guru and at past organizations. So I want to dive into that and really look at specialization at the core, starting with that inbound outbound split, which I think is the most common way that people look at it, looking at the value of doing that, why a company should consider it, and then maybe expanding in some other ways that you've specialized reps that companies haven't considered or thought of that might be able to help drive pipeline in ways that they've never really considered before.
Yeah, awesome. Specialization is an interesting topic. And I'll tell you first and foremost that if you were to ask me this question or this topic a year ago, I would have a completely different view. And I'll tell you why. In the past, I have thought about hiring SDRs for the outbound skill set and giving them inbound as cherry on the top. So you're hiring, SDRs for what I would have previously considered to be the harder SDR role, that outbound hunting motion where, you're climbing the hill and waiting for that one special day when somebody replies and wants a meeting with you, right? And then, getting those inbound leads are, what continues to motivate the rep to kind of do that more difficult prospecting work. My mind frame on that has changed completely. And at Greenlight, we have 4 specific specialized, what we call motions of SDR world. And so what really changed my mind in this is when I started to dig into the results of most of the teams that are dual roles, that are both doing inbound and outbound. Typically, if you have inbound leads that are hand raisers, and then you have cold outbound prospects that don't even know what your company is doing, what are you naturally as a human and a salesperson going to migrate to?
There's a
past.
heavy incentive to go for the hand raisers, right?
Exactly. It's the path of least resistance, right? And so in that world, you tend to get lower results on the outbound side because, right, your outbound folks are migrating more towards converting the inbound leads. Now, that can lead to a higher conversion rate for you from, MQL to meeting set, right, on the inbound side. But typically that outbound focus is going to drop and your results are going to drop there. In my experience, the inbound isn't so much the focus sometimes. The revenue team is looking at that outbound function to drive, greenfield activation or conversion, right? And looking at that function to be that area of growth for the sales team, going out and finding those accounts that don't know about us and educating them and getting them to meet with us. And so that becomes that higher area of focus, yet the reps are incentivized to actually focus more on the inbound function.
Right.
So at Greenlight, specializing has caused me and our revenue leaders to be able to double down much more on our conversion rates per motion and channel. So for example, in our inbound world, we are looking very specifically at each channel, webinar, event, organic, paid, that we have inbound leads being driven to our inbound team and how we are successfully converting those. Another thing I think really plays into this is the skill sets required to do different motions.
For sure.
The inbound motion is striking while the iron is hot. How quickly can I get to that person? Building familiarity is almost, comes in second place over qualification, because in theory, they already know who you are. They came to your site and filled a form out, right? And then again, it's about qualification as that main point. Is this the right kind of customer that we want to talk to, or prospect, I should say, to pass then over to the sales team? It can be a volume game, especially in those beautiful scenarios where you get a lot of inbound leads, right? Then you're kind of working through the volume of who's qualified and maybe who isn't the best fit and how you get that qualification information. Whereas on the outbound side, that is a hunter, right? That good old term, the hunter mindset. It's doing the research prior. It's writing personalized emails that are really identifying the pain of their persona and, relating back to what you can find out about that prospect through research. It's the long game, not the short game of how quickly can I get that person qualified and over. And so that has allowed me to then hire for different skill sets based on background and experience, level of discipline in a candidate's background, so on and so forth. And that having teams that are specialized specifically in those motions have been very successful for us, because we're able to then dive down deeper into what those conversion rates and motions and strategies look like, even to the point where we have different trainings for each motion. So I separate the inbound folks and we meet specifically on those skill sets, the outbound folks and specifically on their challenges in those skill sets. To your point, AJ, your question about, that deeper level of specialization, we have created actually 2 other routes of specialization for SDRs here at Greenlight. So the first is what we call an MDR role, or a market development rep. I currently have one person in that position. I created that position in Q1. The goal for that rep is to just work webinar leads and event leads. How did I come to this conclusion? Well, when we were looking at all of our inbound leads, we are in a great place where we do have a nice solid inbound lead flow. And so our conversion rate from lead to meeting for our organic, our paid channels was high, but we were accepting a low conversion rate on webinar and event leads. And the thought was, well, they're just not as qualified, or, well, they've seen a webinar before and they're more interested in market research, right? And I didn't want to accept that. I determined that we did not have enough focus on those particular lead channels and understanding that audience and what makes them convert and what they're looking for. And so having one person dedicated, and also that person being they dotted line report into marketing, so that they are on the front line of what marketing is doing, which helps the collaboration between sales development and marketing. So we have increased our conversion rate like 3 times over in those channels in a quarter by having one person focus. And the folks that used to get the webinar leads barely notice, because the volume of them spread over so many people. We used to give them to the outbound team, specialization. See here again, they were not really paying attention to them because spread over so many, that area of focus wasn't there.
Right. It's almost like you needed that inbound specialization to then realize that there was another layer of specialization to go into. And you could theoretically do it for, I would say, almost any channel you have.
Yes.
But like for you clearly have enough of a volume on the webinar side of things where it makes sense to then specialize in that area. Maybe if you're an organization where you're getting 30, 40 webinar leads a quarter, it's like, it's not worth it at that point. Right. Correct. But if you have the volume, absolutely, it makes sense for you.
Correct. Yep. The volume is the key here, right? And that's going to be more of your transactional organizations, right? That do have the larger pipelines, maybe the shorter sales cycles, because the other area of specialization that was actually created before I came into Greenlight, which I love and have never seen anywhere before, is what we call reheat. I have a team of 3 SDRs that work close lost pipeline for the AEs. So again, we have a heavy pipeline. We even though we are not considered a transactional, software platform, we do have enough volume where this works. I have one-to-one connections between the AEs and these SDRs, and these SDRs will go back and nurture these opportunities until the time frame is right for them to meet with an AE. Greenlight does work within the medical device industry. We work with med device organizations. Intent can't be created in a time frame fashion for these organizations. Either they're ready to start going through the compliance and we're a quality management system, that QMS process, or they're not. There's no way for us to internally create that intent. And so time frame and also funding becomes a massive factor in our sales process. And so we have a team of SDRs that are nurturing down funnel, where again, you don't have to build that familiarity. It's more of, staying top of mind for when the time is right, we can reactivate and book those meetings.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Excuse me. I really think as you're going through these specializations, I'm thinking back to my time as an SDR and how I did all 4 of these things essentially.
I was thinking the same thing.
And remembering the way I prioritized them, like webinar leads were the worst inbound leads. And you're right, that like the light bulb went off a little bit, because I was like, oh, they're not the worst? You mean there's a better way to do this? Because I think that's just a common idea of every SDR that's followed up with a webinar is like, oh, I've got 5 webinar leads and 1 contact us. That contact us is getting called first every single time.
Yeah.
Right.
So so that was, and then on the reheat side, that one I really like because it increases the relationship between the AEs and the SDRs.
Yes.
Because I had a good relationship with the AEs that I worked with, and it was like every couple of months, maybe my pipeline was running a little dry. They'd be like, here's a handful of mine that have gone dead, but it was very informal. There was no structure to it. It was just like, oh, you need a few, here's a few. So that's really cool that you've been able to not only give structure to that process, but have someone own it and understand that like, this is your priority. This is what you need to do. And then be able to take the time to create messaging around that. I think that's one of the biggest things that specialization will allow you to do, right?
Yep, 100%. And the strategy is different for each one, right? And so then doubling down on those strategies just helps increase conversion. The other thing I love about the reheat motion, and I do believe that a factor in this is an organization's thought process on AEs creating their own pipeline. Where do you think an AE is going to go first if they have to generate opportunities for themselves?
I mean, depending on the organization, if you've got like a slush pile, I think that's how a lot of people do it. If like the old close lost opportunities that are kind of just free game for you to go into that are a couple of years old, it's so much easier to start that conversation.
Right. And so that then creates a natural
Friction.
Thank you. A natural friction between an SDR and an AE if they're both playing in the same pool, if you have a repeat SDR, right? And so taking that away and being able to have the AEs, I know this might be unpopular for some folks, but having the AEs focus on closing and have the SDR team focus on booking the meetings. Yes, we generate 70% plus of the new business pipeline for the AEs, but there's also goals specifically for what the SDRs are focused on. And then that friction doesn't exist. Then you have the AE that is willing to, meet with the SDR and say, hey, here are the ops you want to go after because it's their job, right? And then the AE is able to focus on taking meetings and closing as opposed to prospecting on their own.
Yeah. I think it's all about incentives, right? Like when the way that you talked about the friction that kind of arises between these two teams is because they're both incentivized to do the same thing.
Yes.
But like, obviously you want to do it before the other team does, because then you get the attribution for it, you get comped on it. But if you then incentivize them differently around a common goal, then it's almost like you have to work together towards that. Unless you are internally sabotaging your own team on purpose, then that's just a red flag in general for that employee.
Right. And that's rare. I feel like that's definitely not the norm. I think, SDRs are craving that relationship with AEs because they want to learn and they want, someone to help teach them on how to get to that next step. And so another thing at Greenlight that's really defined for us is the career path from SDR to AE.
I was just about to ask you exactly almost this question. So go for it. And then I'll supplement.
It's beautiful. It's the most beautiful one I've seen ever, honestly. And it's because the company fully embraces and wants to build a team of AEs that are earlier within their career. So many times I've either seen or worked at organizations where the expectation and the persona of who you're hiring as an SDR, and then what you're trying to hire as an AE, 10 years experience in the space, a Rolodex of companies they can call right away. Well, how in the world is an SDR going to bridge that gap and get over there? It's just never going to happen. Greenlight is the opposite. Half of our AE team was SDRs at Greenlight.
That's awesome.
And so they understand the role of the SDR, right? And will help out the SDR and help mentor. Then we have this reheat motion in place, which just helps them to get to know some of the SDRs and build that relationship. And so then the SDR can really see, wow, there is a path for me here, and I'm supported in that path. It's happened before. We've seen it happen successfully before as well. And that just creates much better collaboration, as well as loyalty in some cases from the SDRs, seeing that light at the end of the tunnel that a lot of companies want to pretend is there but doesn't exist. And then they lose amazing talent because, they're getting a shot somewhere else to go and sell.
For sure. Yeah. I wanted to, because it sounds like the way that you've specialized the roles, you have the 4 that you've built internally. Yep. 2 of them are definitely more geared and roll up to the marketing team, and 2 of them are more geared towards the roll up to sales.
Yep.
I wanted to ask if there was any fluidity between, like, say I were an inbound rep on your team and I realized that maybe marketing's not for me and I love sales and I want to go down that pathway to become an account executive. Can I then maybe move on to the reheat team and start building that relationship with the AEs, or vice versa? I'm on the reheat side of things. Sales isn't for me. I think marketing is more my calling. Can I jump over to the inbound side of things and start building up those pathways? Because I think that's like, there are a lot of rigid structures at organizations where it's like, oh, you're an SDR. We fully expect you in the next 12 to 18 months to become an AE here. That's it. Like, that's all you're going to get. But I didn't want to do that in my career. I moved into marketing. Alex, I know you were the same way. I would feel like I'm being pigeonholed essentially if I worked at that organization to get forced down the sales funnel when I want to move into marketing. And it sounds like you are anti that and have built a way for people to kind of experience a bunch of different departments and responsibilities.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. So every time I have an SDR leave, whether they're promoted or whatever the case may be, I open up the role first to the internal team. So in that case, I actually, one of my outbound SDRs is the one that moved over to the MDR position. I have 2 outbound folks that moved from outbound over into inbound. I have folks that have moved from inbound to reheat and outbound to reheat. So the way I view this as, what additional tools do you want in your tool belt? And that does usually play into career growth, right? Whether somebody's maybe looking more into account management. And so reheat's a little bit more attractive because that's very much about owning a pipeline of people that have a very specific issue that we're trying to nurture and then get back in front of them, when that issue is potentially not an issue anymore. And it's really much more of, when do I need to call Bob back? Not I need to get Bob on the phone and explain what green light is, but I know there's a compelling event in Bob's life and I need to, be in charge of managing that time frame, right? And so they all, yes, have different, pieces of career growth within them. And I've had several people move in between the different roles so that they can gain more skills in another area.
That's great. And I think that's like, for anyone who's struggling with bringing talent into their organization, like, take note, because this is how you get people to come into the organization in the first place. This is a huge recruiting tool for you, I'm sure, knowing that you have this fluidity and opportunity to build up these skills. But it's how you retain talent, right? Like you said, you've had people move in between teams. I'm sure there were probably opportunities for them to look at other organizations. But why bother when internally the team that you want to be on has a rec open up and you can stay there for another 6 months or whatever, how long you want to stay, to build up more skills in the career direction you want to go.
Yes, exactly. Yes, 100%. And it changes a lot of conversations when you have that option. We all know, at least in my experience, an SDR tenure is what? 12 to 24 months. 24 if you're lucky. Jeez. Right? Typically 12 to 18, right? Generally. And so instead of pretending like that doesn't exist or trying to convince folks to stay within a role that they don't want to do, I like to say this to my team: nobody's going to retire from being an SDR. Apologies to anyone out there that has, but it's very uncommon. And typically it's a stepping stone. It's a learning time frame to build skills for something else. Embrace that, right? And so I know that I'm only going to have my folks for a certain amount of time. How can I help them build those skills to then move into that next piece for them, whether it's internally or not? That's the other thing. We cannot, ignore as sales development leaders that half of your team, if not more, is likely going to move on to another organization, especially if you do not have a solid, achievable career path internally. So why not help them to determine what that next best fit is for them, instead of, thinking that they're going to stay with you for years and years and continue to be an SDR?
Right. Yeah, it's just not going to happen. The reality of the situation is, internally at Demand Drive, we have the opportunity oftentimes for reps to move up to their client as like internal AEs or SDR managers or whatever. And normally that's like technically looked at as voluntary turnover, right? Like somebody left the organization. But to us, it's a huge win because it means that we've done our job, and any SDR leader, like you said, looks at it as their job of developing the talent and the foundational skills within your reps so that they can take those and use it as the stepping stone that it's supposed to be into another opportunity somewhere else, that might end up coming back to help you in the future. There are probably opportunities for them to come back and potentially lead a team or work with you in some capacity in another organization. Like there is, like you said, this mentality that you want reps to stay forever because churn is expensive. But,
sure, of course.
But it's like a glass shatter moment where you just have to get over it and realize that it's better to build up and create a culture where people want to join, build up skills, and then move on to another opportunity, because it keeps bringing more people into your recruiting pipeline. You can keep churning out good quality SDRs. That's way better than hoping they stay.
Right, because it's just not achievable. And what's to say we can't plan for that? What's to say as revenue leaders that we don't embrace it and plan for that? And so our career path, we open up, so we have a promotion at 6 months and a promotion at 12 months on the SDR team. So SDR2 and then senior SDR. And there's just basic things that you need to get to the steps. Some basic expectations of achievement, right? 80% of your goal for 2 consecutive months. Everybody gets that, right? Very achievable steps with, base salary increases to keep folks really committed during that time they're on the SDR team. And then around the 12-month mark, depending on the rep, is the time that they can start looking elsewhere internally. And so then you open up, the door is open to have that conversation. It's not that conversation where, I think it's time for me to leave, but I'm afraid to tell my boss. It's much more of a, hey, we're getting to that time. What do you want to do? And that just makes for a much better culture, much better relationship between leader and rep. And it turns out, I think, much more success and ultimately retaining talent due to loyalty. As opposed to, again, having those awkward conversations or reps feeling like they can't be open about the fact they don't want to be an SDR forever.
Yeah, transparency is huge.
Yes.
Yeah. Really quickly, I know we've got a couple other things we want to touch on, but these are all awesome ideas, structures, strategies that you've put together. What are some of the challenges, or I don't want to call them cons or negatives, but like some of the challenges? I know you mentioned like maybe some sales reps don't like what's going on in the like it affects their ability to build up their own pipeline. What are some of those issues or roadblocks or obstacles you face building this up and putting these specializations in place?
I'll tell you the number one thing is folks thinking the grass is greener from outbound. So another thing that we fully support and embrace at Greenlight is folks that don't have an SDR background. So I have folks from all walks of life on my team, healthcare backgrounds, like fitness backgrounds, military backgrounds, because to me, it's about discipline. It's about accountability. It's about willingness and motivation. It's about self-motivation. It's not about, have you played in sports? Sure, there's a discipline there, but there are other disciplines in life, not just sports.
Yeah, the prototypical things you look for. Yeah,
exactly. Right. There's a lot more out there that can mirror that sports discipline in other areas of life. We have a bunch of folks that are career changers that just needed a shot to get in as an SDR to a tech company that we've hired. And so what comes with that is the lack of that context of some of these typical SDR struggles. And so I will frequently have somebody that maybe is struggling in a particular motion that then comes to me and wants to move to another motion, right? And so, dealing with that and trying to understand what is really the issue that we're going through. Oh, you're having your first low month ever. Okay, let's talk about this because it is extremely common
Sound
in
the
SDR
alarm.
world, right? But I remember when I was an SDR thinking, oh my gosh, this isn't for me. I must not be good at sales because, wow, I'm having a low month and I don't know what's going on. And I don't know why my activity is not converting into meetings. It's so common, but having those conversations with folks that are new to sales, whether it's somebody out of college or somebody making a career change, and explaining how sales is a roller coaster. And the most important part to me about being an SDR is consistency in activity and in your mind frame through the ups and the downs. Continuing to put the activity in when you're having a month where you haven't set a meeting or haven't talked to somebody in like 2 weeks, right? That consistency is key, and letting them know that they're not alone and that it's something that happens with literally every single SDR. And I have that conversation with every single one of those peers every couple of months. And then guess what? The next week comes and they set 5 meetings, right? And so that's, I think, the biggest challenge is when you do open that door and and I want to embrace folks getting different abilities and different tools in their tool belt, also not wanting to encourage folks to just jump when things get tough, because sales can be tough. And just because you're having a bad month does not mean you're a bad outbound SDR and leaning on data and calls and things we can point to say, look, you are great at what you're doing. Let's hold out for another month and then come back to this conversation. And if it's really the case at that point, we'll discuss then, some type of move into another motion.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that like you essentially, by specializing so much, you give the opportunities for people to jump, and it's such a natural inclination to want to do that. Whereas in normal cases, like you don't have a point to jump to. If you're just an SDR at a company, and there's no other role other than SDR that you can jump to, it's like, well, I might as well just jump off the boat entirely.
Right. And I'm sure that there are so many people out there that started to struggle as a sales rep and thought it was them and did jump off the boat. I can remember being in that position when I was selling and thinking I wasn't going to hit my quota. And then a couple of days later, I got a couple bluebirds, or a couple people, ended up replying, or I got someone on the phone who was right in the middle of an evaluation. And so I think that's the best and worst part about sales, is that every single day is different. And anything can happen at any given point because there's so much that we can't control as the rep.
For sure. I wanted to take a lot of what you said and kind of turn the lens a little bit towards the enablement side of things, because it sounds like you've done internally at Greenlight a great job at enabling the SDR function, something that maybe a lot of organizations don't tend to do. They funnel a ton of resources into closing reps because that's typically where money is made, right? Like you close deals, the company goes up in revenue. So they give them all of the training and workshops and resources and classes, et cetera, and pump money into it. But then the SDRs kind of get left behind. And you've found a way to effectively enable the SDR function. And like we had talked about before even recording this, generate a significantly higher portion of the overall closed won opportunities from your function versus from the AE function through that. And I think a lot of companies can learn a thing or two about enabling that function properly. So I wanted to dive into your, I guess, just mindset around like enabling SDRs, what that looks like, how you can effectively do that as a leader, and what type of support somebody who is considering funneling some resources into that function can do to make sure that they are as successful as possible.
Yeah, this is a great topic, and one that's very close to my heart, because SDRs, I don't think always get the credit that they deserve, and they don't always get the attention they deserve, and especially not the enablement they deserve. One thing at Greenlight is we are super enablement focused, and I can't take full credit for that. That was in place before I started. So we actually have 2 enablement sessions a week just on the SDR team. So we have a Tuesday afternoon session and a Thursday afternoon session, and I will split those up. Sometimes I'll do it as a group session. Sometimes we'll split into motions, and I'll have my manager take one motion, another manager take another motion. And then I am blessed to have a sales enablement team that helps support me as well. But I will tell you what, sales enablement background, to your point, AJ, is typically on closing reps.
Right.
So what ends up happening is then I am helping to teach the sales enablement team what needs to be enabled on the SDR team, because that's just not a career path that we have in this market, which I think is, and I hope is something that ends up starting to grow. The SDR team in and of itself, in my opinion, needs an enablement person dedicated to that team. I've started to see this in the market at some larger companies, some open roles around this, and I have never seen this before, and it gets me really pumped up. The SDRs are typically, could be entry level, don't necessarily have sales background. They are maybe early in their careers. And so that foundation isn't there. And if an organization doesn't have, for example, a sales methodology training course to put folks through that come through on the revenue team, or some type of extremely detailed and, formulated training and enablement, I think we forget, even I forget as a sales development leader, how much we expect these folks to know. Personas, talk tracks, ICP, qualification, and we just teach it to them once and expect that they're going to know it.
I saw a funny graphic someone put up on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago where it was just a person with like a fire hose spraying in their, like a full fire hose just spraying in their face. And they were like a
Yes.
real life look at an SDR after their first week of
Yes.
training, right? Like you just
Right.
give them everything in 5 days and it's like, all right, go get them.
Right. And when you think about it, let's think about the AE teams we know and love out there. Are they all new people to sales?
No.
No,
Like never,
maybe
almost.
one or two, but the team in and of itself typically has some level of tenured sales folks on there, maybe folks that have been on there for years, definitely people that have had sales background, whether it was an SDR or selling before, but we funnel the enablement to these folks that have a foundation and then leave it up to the sales leaders, the sales development leaders to build the foundation for the SDRs. I know that I don't typically have the time and the bandwidth to always do that, even though I want to. And so I hope that as just, a sales, market, a sales community, I guess, that we can embrace more of where we need that enablement. And I think the majority of it needs to be in this SDR teams who are the front line. They are the first person who we are trusting to speak to our highest quality leads, to speak openly to the cold market about what we're doing and build familiarity. This is a crucial role. And typically the pipeline expectation, it's high up there, usually half or more of what's expected of this team to generate.
Right.
And yet we just don't funnel the resources towards it. So I have done, again, I'm super blessed to have an amazing sales enablement team that I work with, and they have been so helpful in helping me to develop some additional SDR enablement. Again, Greenlight focuses on enablement for our SDR team. So we meet twice a week, and it's all kinds of topics from the market, from, sales development skills. We also do ring or role play sessions 3 days a week in the morning, just to get the juices flowing, just to start to break through that level of embarrassment, right? Of needing to kind of pitch in front of your peers, because that makes calls easier. But not all teams are, have, again, the resources or the time to be able to devote to it. And I hope that that's something we can focus on more as a sales development community.
Yeah. I'm curious if, because we're talking about SDRs right and often, it's not just the SDR or sales role they don't know. It's what is it to work in an office? What is it to work in 9 to 5 in an office? Yes. I guess I should air quotes around that today. But do you work that sort of stuff into the SDR enablement as well?
So that is a great point. I have recently started to, put some of that into our onboarding, as well as what's a SaaS company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does a SaaS company operate? What are the goals? What does each department do? How will you or won't you interact with that department? And how is that department going to affect your success? I also like to do every quarter an expectations presentation. And I've found another key piece to managing and enabling SDRs is repetition. Because again, we give them information and then in 1 hour and expect that they walk away an expert at our persona, right?
Yeah, you just know it.
Go back, right? We need to go back. We need to review this information more than once, because that's just learning, right? The first time that we learn something, my sales enablement director, Missy, I know she'll get mad if I get this percentage wrong. I think we only retain like 10 or 20% of what we learned the first time.
Sounds right.
That repetition is just so crucial for these entry-level folks. And so every quarter I do an expectation presentation where we review the results of the quarter before, talk about our goals for the next quarter, and then talk about those basic housekeeping pieces. What are our working hours here? What's my expectation around performance? If you're not performing, what's going to happen? What does that process look like? Having those tough conversations, right? Talking about the expectations in meetings. We're a camera on organization. Company meetings are mandatory. Team meetings are mandatory. All of those pieces I like to regurgitate every quarter for new folks and just to remind folks as well, because you're right. Where is there the class in college on how to work at a business?
Exactly.
Or remote, right?
I was going to say specifically now,
right? That like, wearing a stained t-shirt is probably not the thing to do when you're coming on a Zoom call with your colleagues, right? It's a real thing that we as a society, I don't know if we do the best job at kind of teaching these folks earlier in their career, these core concepts. And when you lose the office, you lose the peer-to-peer, just unconscious, let me learn and mirror what's happening around me. And it just opens up the door to interpretation. And sometimes that interpretation isn't on the right mark.
Right. It's like, especially with the Zoom side of things, kids coming out of college, it's a very different thing to be on a college class in Zoom. You rarely participate. Most professors will let you just like have the camera off, from what I've seen or heard, versus, right, you said you're a camera on organization. That like, it's a totally different expectation, but to them, it probably doesn't look as different as an office does to a classroom, right? And
I'm sorry, but their parents didn't work in this virtual world. So if you go to mom and dad and say, well, what am I supposed to do here? I'm not sure they're going to know.
They're like, we were hoping you would tell us.
Right. Exactly. Right. And so again, that kind of generational piece to it as well. We're in a new world, folks. Right. And that's totally fine. But as leaders, we need to make sure that we're, taking that responsibility of helping our younger or newer folks learn the ins and outs of working at an organization or a SaaS organization, because it's different than what anyone else has really experienced.
For sure. Yeah, I think, and we chatted about this beforehand on the prep call for this, but we talked about how, like, to you, this is second nature, right? Like you've sort of grown up in this world and in sort of the being an SDR and managing SDRs. A lot of this stuff is like, of course, I know that I have to do this enablement stuff because they're not coming in equipped to actually swim after we throw them in the pool most of the times. A lot of people who maybe don't have that background or haven't been an SDR or directly managed a function like that, as you said, tend to have a lot of opinions about how it's supposed to run, but don't really know the nitty gritty or the day in and the day out. They look at it from that 30,000 foot view and go like, well, why isn't my team performing the way it should? We have X, Y, and Z in place that should just work. Do you think that it's a necessity to have managed a team or been involved in the sales dev role in some capacity to really know how to lead that function and make sure that it's successful? Or can theoretically you as a manager build a playbook and sort of by educating someone who from outside the organization, if they come in through just like reading and learning in a traditional sense, how to actually run that function?
That's a great question. I think at the end of the day, it does depend on the person, but I will tell you that I didn't get to this place of it feeling like second nature overnight. I went through the trials and tribulations and frankly struggles of being an SDR for 2 years. I went through the experience of having to build my own pipeline as an AE because the SDR function 8 whatever years ago is not what it is today. And it was just based on inbound leads. And if you had a territory where you got none, you had to figure it out. Right. And so I think just those learning moments along the way, and honestly, the pain and struggle have really helped me to build my thought processes and my opinions and my passions about sales and sales development that I have today. I do think that really that experience points to a lot of wisdom and a lot of learning. I do think it can be harder for folks that don't have that to manage the function, but I have seen leaders of the function that have been successful that haven't been in the role. My advice would be get as close to that role as you possibly can. So if you haven't been an SDR, but somehow you're managing them, get on the phone with your team at some point and learn what the market is saying and what the kinds of people are that your team is discussing. That view in and of itself is is so crucial. Another thing you can do is just sit side by side for an entire sales cycle with an AE, from the SDR call to the qual call, to the disco call, to the demo. You have to understand what the prospects are like. And that's also for folks like me who have sold and been an SDR, coming into a new company, coming into a new product, coming into a new market. I also need to learn those things as well, so that, again, I know how to coach my team with the actual personas that we're selling to. Because I'll tell you, a CMO at a SaaS company, which is who I sold to at my last company, is a lot different than a product engineer at a medical device company, which is who we sell to at Greenlight, right? And so those pieces are crucial. And so get as close to it as you can. Get on the phones. I don't know how, that's a huge thing. I don't know something that will help you build buy-in with your team more than if they actually see you doing the job, or they know that you've done the job in the past. So it's okay if you haven't been an SDR, but try it out for a day. You're going to be a lot closer to your team and really understand what they're going through. And I think that'll help your strategies moving forward.
Yeah, I love seeing VPs of sales who are like, yeah, I was an SDR for a day and I've totally changed my point of view about how this team runs. It's like, yeah, you think? Like, when you get to look at it from a totally different point of view, from just the output side of things rather than all of the inputs that go in, it's a very different understanding of how the function works.
I mean, I can sit here all day and tell my team that they have to make X amount of calls a day. But what if they don't have the ability or don't know to tell me that the CRM doesn't have any phone numbers in it? If the phone numbers don't connect, if our data tool isn't giving us the data that we don't want to, if they aren't able to get through to decision makers for XYZ reason. Sometimes reps don't know to communicate that stuff. Sometimes you have reps that are just trying to do it and check the box. But you as a leader, me as a leader, I don't see those struggles, and then so I can't help. So it's so important. Another thing you can do is side by sides, and how I do them virtually is, hey, open up a Zoom and share your screen and just walk through some of your processes and let me watch. That opens up so much conversation. You know what, Karlie, I'm actually kind of struggling with this. Oh, I can see you're struggling. Let's talk through that, right?
Yeah.
And then that helps me to understand the roadblocks I can continue to remove for my team.
Awesome. Well, Karlie, thanks so much for hopping on the show. I know I learned a thing or two. I've never managed a team before. I've managed people, but not like a full team. And there are some things that you mentioned that thinking back, I'm like, oh, that's a clippable moment. Oh, that's really impactful. Oh, I bet a leader listening to this would really want to take that to their team and make sure that their reps are enabled as possible. Thank you again for being here. If people want to continue the conversation, get in touch with you, learn more about you or Greenlight, how can they do that?
Please find me on LinkedIn. Karlie Morien, Karlie is the first name. Not many of those out there. And also, you could even always reach out to me, message me on LinkedIn. I am more than happy to, join in conversations. I'm in Pavilion as well. You can find me in there too.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again for being here. This is the Unsubscribe podcast. Remember to subscribe to Unsubscribe, get more solid sales development tips and insight like this in your inbox. And we'll catch you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Thanks for watching this episode of Unsubscribe, the Demand Drive podcast. If you want less of those nasty unsubscribe emails in your inbox, go ahead and check out some of the content we have to the left, and make sure that you subscribe to Unsubscribe to keep your SDR team in tip-top shape.